It is not a denial of Jesus' intentions to provide atonement that we examine the political climate which led to his execution. On the contrary, it is a confirmation of his wisdom in choosing the perfect time for laying down his life for us. After the Maccabees' successful revolt, circa 165 BCE, this is a story of Hanukkah. Judah's brothers, strengthened partly by Judah's alliance with distant Rome, each later ruled simultaneously as king and high priest in Judea. This was unprecedented and unpopular among the most devout Jews because, although the family of Mattathias and Judah were priests, they were not descendants of Zadok, the family that had held the position of high priest since the return of the exiles from Babylon. Nor were they descendants of King David. And in spite of their success in throwing off Hellenistic rule, the Hasmoneans, Judah's family, surprisingly led Judea into Hellenistic ways. The loss of complete trust in the leadership of the priesthood helped to create serious divisions among the Jewish people and was a contributing factor to the establishment of differing sects, like the Sadducees, Pharisees, Essenes, and Zealots, as well as lesser-known Jewish sects. This division made the people even more vulnerable to foreign domination, just as Rome was reaching the zenith of its power. The Essenes essentially opted out of the sacrificial system, while the Sadducees became strong supporters of both the Hasmonean priesthood and of the Western influences which they brought in. Did you know that the family tomb of Caiaphas, who was a Sadducee, was found in the 90s, and that all of the bodies had been buried with 2 coins over their eyes? These coins were to pay the ferryman who would row the dead over the river Styx. That is Greco-Roman theology. The Pharisees were much more volatile and resisted any foreign or pagan influences, often violently. This led to much political upheaval and to many thousands of Jewish deaths in the years leading up to Jesus' ministry. Some examples. A riot protesting the rule of Hasmonean Alexander Yannaeus erupted. 6,000 citizens were executed. After another revolt, Alexander Yannaeus had 800 rebels crucified, their wives and children butchered before their eyes while they were hanging. In 61 BCE, Hasmonean John Hyrcanus and Antipater invited the Roman army into Jerusalem as their allies in a power fight. Antipater was Herod the Great's grandfather and an Idumean, whose people had been forcibly converted to Judaism by the Hasmoneans' desire for expanding empire. Eventually, the Roman general Pompey killed 12,000 Jews before he entered the temple and walked straight into the Holy of Holies, which was forbidden to all but the high priest, and then only once a year to make atonement for the people's sins on Yom Kippur. In 40 BCE, Rome temporarily lost control of Palestina. Palestina is Latin for land of the Philistines, so named to be an insult to Jews. Herod the Great escaped to Rome, where he gave the impression of one who could hold the country on Rome's behalf. The Roman senators thereby named Herod the King of the Jews, and upon his return he slaughtered many thousands. His friend Mark Antony himself killed the last Hasmonean ruler, Antigonus. Herod later built a fortress for Rome overshadowing the Temple Mount, named after his Roman friend, the Fortress Antonia. When Herod died, leaving 2 wills and 3 sons, Archelaus, Philip, and Antipas, after he himself had killed his wife and 2 of his own sons. The 3 remaining sons were summoned to Rome to distribute the kingdom according to Rome's best interests. On the eve of their departure, both locals and pilgrims who were in Jerusalem for the Passover held demonstrations of mourning over Rome's increasing usurpation and her intention to split the country into 3 separate provinces. Archelaus sent his troops into the temple courts just after the first paschal lambs had been slaughtered and had 3,000 protesters killed. 5 weeks later, on Shavuot, that is Pentecost, while the brothers were still away in Rome, another riot broke out. Sabinus of Syria sent troops into Jerusalem, but was unable to contain the mob until he set fire to the porticos of the Temple Mount. When the riot was quelled, the Romans then crucified 2,000 rebels. The Talmud reports 2,000 Pharisees nailed to the city walls because there was not enough wood available to make so many crosses. When Pontius Pilate entered Jerusalem as the new prefect, he raised his standards, which included a portrait of Caesar on the Fortress Antonia. Since the Caesars were now calling themselves gods, Jews counted these as pagan images flying within sight of the Holy of Holies. An angry mob gathered around Pilate's residence in Caesarea, where they sat outside in a quiet protest for 5 days before he summoned them to his amphitheater with promise of an answer. When they arrived, his troops drew their swords. But the protesters dropped to the ground as one and bared their necks, crying that they would rather die than break their laws. Pilate was astonished and gave in. Mark's gospel tells us that as soon as the chief priests heard about Jesus' demonstration against the money changers in the court of the Gentiles, they were resolved to get rid of him. Any threat to the temple, especially during the crowded and emotional festival of Passover, which represented, after all, freedom from tyranny, was likely to lead to violence, which in turn could result in dreadful reprisals by Rome. Was Jesus, from a human and political perspective, dangerous? You bet he was. Let's ask ourselves honestly, were the fears of Roman destruction valid? The Roman general Titus burned the temple to the ground in 70 CE as a response to the first Jewish revolt, and effectively put an end to Sadducees, Essenes, and smaller groups. Pharisees and Nazarenes survived, as well as the Zealots, who continued to fight back against Rome and foreign domination. The estimated death toll, 1 million. Since Herod the Great, in his remodeling of the temple, had coated its inner walls with gold, Roman soldiers were highly motivated after its destruction to pull one stone apart from another to get at the gold. This fulfilled Jesus' prophecy in Luke 21:5, that not one stone would be left standing upon another. In 131 CE, the second Jewish revolt began, led by the false Messiah Bar Kokhba. After Hadrian forbade circumcision, ordination of rabbis, teaching Torah, and public Jewish meetings, the same issues involved in the Maccabean revolt. Although the rebels were successful for a while, in the end Rome triumphed. 580,000 more Jews perished. Hadrian leveled Jerusalem, and Jews were now forbidden on pain of death to enter it. it was renamed Aelia Capitolina after Aelius Hadrianus, then was remade into a modern Roman city dedicated to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. A temple to Aphrodite was built on the hill of Golgotha. Was Jesus omniscient in the flesh? It's an interesting question, subject of some debate and of theological schism. Let me answer only that he probably had a clue as to the nature of the suffering that awaited him. For one thing, crucifixion and its counterpart, impaling, was common and was much older than Rome, widespread especially in the eastern half of the world. Rome limited this terrible torture to criminals and slaves. Of course, rebels were considered criminals, and rebellious Judea was littered with crosses, called Slavim in Jesus' day. The executions were quite public, held outside the gates of the cities along the most populous roads. After an uprising, it was not uncommon for several hundred crucifixions to take place all at once. As I mentioned, the Talmud records a time when not enough wood could be found to make all the crosses necessary to punish the rebels captured, so 2,000 were nailed to the very walls of Jerusalem. Rome's attitude was cruel. The idea of compassion and a limit to punishment and reprisal was a supremely Jewish concept based on Torah's instructions. It is no wonder then that Jesus was so distraught just hours before his arrest that he longed for a change in the plans that had been laid before the foundation of the world. It would have been easier for him not to know. Great physical, mental, or emotional anguish can raise one's blood pressure so high that smaller blood vessels begin to break. The blood thus released can find itself then swept up into the sweat glands and appear outside the body. This is called hematidrosis, and Luke's gospel records Jesus to be in this condition in Gethsemane that night. Besides a natural fear of bodily harm, the sin of all of us were then pressed upon his innocent spirit. What a horrible and crushing weight that must have seemed to him. The next terrible blow came from his intimate friend, Judas of Creote, who handed Jesus over to the authorities, who were anxious to eliminate this threat. Once in the hands of both the Jewish and the Roman authorities, there was little chance for Jesus to be treated justly, because a great deal of their concerns had nothing to do with Jesus specifically. The Jewish authorities were, in truth, trying to save their people from another exile or from outright extinction. Their immediate fear of Roman power blinded them to the reality of God's power and to his ability to demonstrate it by protecting them from Rome, just as he had with Egypt. The Roman authorities, for their part, were so intent, here as elsewhere in their empire, on keeping peace and power at all cost, that individual lives and individual justice held little value for them. For many reasons, including Rome's hatred of Jews, the early church was anxious to separate itself from Jews and to earn Roman respect. Thus we have the portrait of Pontius Pilate trying to save Jesus from the condemnation of the Sanhedrin. Not likely. Pilate was so murderous and self-serving that after James, head of the newborn church, was killed, 70 Pharisees protested to Rome, which removed Pilate from his position in disgrace. Rome's concern was still not justice, but in keeping a major rebellion from breaking out. His removal did not ultimately succeed in that purpose. Scourging was frequently the punishment of choice and could be deadly all by itself. Some experts say that when ancient historians record someone being flayed alive or skinned alive, it is scourging to which they are referring. Romans mostly used a short-handled flare called a flagrum, which had 3 leather thongs, although they had other versions. Attached to the ends of the thongs would be heavy pieces of bone or lead. These would slice open the flesh in long lines first, and afterward they would dig deeper, gouging out bits of flesh and flinging them into the air. There would be a tremendous blood loss, and eventually the victim would be hanging by his arms in a pool of his own blood, his skin hanging in shreds from his body. In Jesus' case, there was already some tenderness and blood loss due to the hematidrosis. No wonder he was later stumbling and falling. Deuteronomy 25:3 limits the number of strokes that may be given as punishment to 40. To show an attitude of mercy, the Pharisees had lessened it to 39. And this is probably the origin of the tradition of 39 strokes. But the Romans had no such limits. Experts disagree whether Rome would have respected local Jewish customs in such matters, including the forbidding of naked crucifixions. But it is interesting to note that the Shroud of Turin shows no such restraint, but evidence of over 100 strokes given, all tripart wounds. Experts also disagree whether scourging the victim always preceded crucifixions, or only sometimes. Since crucifixions sometimes lasted days before death came, and because it was sometimes the purpose of the Romans to prolong the agony, it does seem unlikely that scourging and crucifixion were always done in tandem. The scourging resulted in a great loss of blood and subsequent weakness. This would facilitate a rather quick death, as is recorded of Jesus. Crucifixions had variables, like all human endeavors. It may be true that the entire cross was dragged to the execution place sometimes, but in most cases only the crossbar, called the patibulum, was carried by the person condemned. It could weigh more than 100 pounds on its own. This was placed upon Jesus' shredded and raw back, maybe with a bit of cloth between. It appears that in some places the upright post was raised by ropes and secured by rocks set in a hole, but that in other places, probably in Jerusalem where crucifixions were numerous, a permanent fence was erected with multiple posts on which to attach crossbars and bodies. Sometimes the upright post contained a rest for the feet, or a bar to sit on called a sedel. These appendages would make the experience a little more comfortable, of course, taking some of the weight of the body off of the arms of the victim and making it much easier for the victim to breathe. They would also, therefore, have resulted in a more lingering death. Since the 1930s, when French doctor Pierre Barbet wrote his groundbreaking book, A Doctor at Calvary, translated into English in 1963, most of us are aware of his theory that the nails were placed in the wrists, not the hands of the crucified. This was established by Barbet's experimentation regarding which part of the hands could carry the weight of a man without the nails tearing through the flesh, which would have resulted in the body falling off the cross. Of course, this was startling news to believers, because artistic portrayals of Jesus' crucifixion had consistently shown nails in the palms before Barbet's book. If the nails were placed where Barbet holds, they would have damaged the median nerve and would have sent excruciating pain bursting through to his fingertips and all the way up to his shoulders. Only the strongest of men, or the strongest of will, as Barbet wrote, would be able to avoid fainting with such pain. Barbet's theories have ruled for nearly a century, but have been challenged by medical authorities in our own day. Dr. Frederick Zugibe, a forensic pathologist, was chief medical examiner for Rockland County, New York, for 33 years and had long studied the gospel accounts. He pointed out that the name spot, space, framed by bone, which Barbet identified in the wrist, is actually in the base of the hand itself. But Zugibe identified what he considered a more likely spot in the hand, just inside the ridge of the thumb base. This, he reported, is framed even more strongly with bone. This spot is now referred to as the Z spot, after Zugibe himself. It also crosses the median nerve. For those who believe that tradition has a basis in truth, Zugibe's theories make sense. When you envision nails, do you think of smooth stainless steel instruments from your local hardware store? Probably, but how silly. Rome made rough nails by hand out of iron. Smooth and even would have been a blessing, but the likely roughness of the nails must have given every tiny movement, even a word, new flashes of pain. There is disagreement both in artistic depiction and in medical interpretation regarding blood loss due to the nails. Some experts believe that efficiency would have led Romans to drive them in such a way as to keep the mess to a minimum, and also to keep the victim alive as long as possible, in case a long torture was planned for him. Again, there are records of crucifixions which lasted days before death. Other experts propose that deep wounds in tender places, such as the hands, would have bled profusely, trickled down the victim's arms and then down his sides, and from his feet to form a pool at the base of the cross. This would be theologically consistent, since the blood of a sacrifice was to be splashed at the base of an altar. Here's a photo of Roman nails, too small for crucifixions, that I bought from an archaeological gallery. There has been less theorizing about the pierced feet because the hands would have held the crucified victim's weight. Most often, tradition shows one foot crossed over the other and pierced together with only one nail. But there are ancient depictions which show each foot nailed separately. A footrest is shown sometimes, sometimes not. A 1968 archaeological find in Israel gives some new ideas. In Jesus' time, bodies would be buried and allowed to decompose quickly. Then the clean bones would be reburied nicely about a year after death. In one of these ossuaries, or bone deposits, the bones of a crucified victim were found. In the feet, nails are still stuck in the bones. These show that this man, Yehochanan, had his feet nailed to the outer sides of the upright post, the nails driven sideways into his ankles. There are various theories about how Jesus died, but it is clear that crucifixion, as well as any form of hanging with the arm raised over the head, makes breathing extremely difficult. The Nazis used this form of execution in the concentration camps sometimes tying people to a post which was high enough to lift them off their feet with arms held over their heads. The victims, unable to breathe in this position, quickly suffocated. Jesus would not have been able to take in much oxygen while hanging and would have found it even harder to exhale. Barbet's theory, based partly on evidence from the Shroud of Turin, is that the victim would push himself up by placing the weight of his body on the nail in his feet in order to inhale and exhale freely for a time. Besides the pain involved, of course, this would require great strength from a person in a much weakened condition, so he would not be able to maintain it for a time. He would fall, probably tearing new bits of flesh in hands and feet each time, and then be gasping for breath once again. The evidence on the shroud shows the blood flow in both hands and feet going in two different angles, suggesting this rocking up and down for air. Zujibe's book, The Crucifixion of Jesus, A Forensic Inquiry, includes an exhaustive listing of ideas regarding the possible cause of Jesus' death. Chief among them, by the time Jesus arrived on Golgotha bearing his cross, he was already in very bad shape. Add to that the trauma of being nailed through the hands and feet, and you have a recipe for what Zujibe calls hypovolemic shock, a condition caused by severe loss of blood and body fluids. Simply put, Jesus lost so much blood that his heart could no longer supply his organs with the oxygen they needed, so he died. Had your tetanus shot updated lately? There were no such protections, of course, in Jesus' day, and tetany would have shown itself a few hours after the wounds were made. This would have made Jesus' limbs tight and rigid, twisting his body uncontrollably and adding further agony, but also illustrating Psalms 22's line 14. All my bones are out of joint. And what about Psalm 22's next line? My tongue cleaves to my jaws. Jesus made it clear that he was thirsty. Great blood loss alone would make his body scream for fluid replacement. But his body had been strained in other ways also. He had had no sleep, had been much wounded, and also carried that heavy crossbar. I'm sure his cross was not standing under the shade of a tree. It likely was on the open, dusty road. Current archaeological theory is that Golgotha was a quarry. And Jerusalem's air tends to be very hot and dry. Is it any wonder that he died quickly? The only wonder is that anyone thought he might last longer. John recorded that when the spear entered Jesus' body, both blood and water flowed out. Many theories regarding how Jesus died are based on that one report. The Mayo Clinic efforts to present his crucifixion in clear medical terms assumes that the spear entered a lung, which they expect would have been bruised, swollen, and filled with fluid due to the impact of the scourging. He was dead. It is recorded in the Talmud and the Encyclopedia Judaica that nails from crucifixions are never found by archaeologists, even in areas where many crucifixions had taken place. That is because the Talmud says both Jews and Romans considered the nails from a cross to have healing power. It is even recorded that a halakhic ruling, a precedent ruling regarding Torah observance, was once made, allowing ill persons to carry such a nail about with them on Shabbat, although any carrying on the Sabbath was usually forbidden as work. Could it be that these gruesome superstitions foreshadowed a theological reality only revealed by the presence of the Holy Spirit in his followers? Some Passover connections. God commanded the Israelites to choose a lamb for their yearly Passover sacrifice on the 10th of Nisan, then to set it aside for inspection until the 14th of Nisan. They had to assure that the lamb was absolutely perfect with no defects. So, Jesus was set before the people on Palm Sunday, the 10th of Nisan, and taught in the temple so that all Israel could inspect him for defects. 4 days later, after his final meal, his sacrifice began. The Passover lamb was traditionally slaughtered, quote, between the evenings, unquote, which always meant between 3 p.m. and 6 p.m. Since the whole lamb had to be roasted by sunset, people usually killed their lambs altogether at 3 p.m. So the Gospels tell us that Jesus gave up his spirit at about 3 p.m., and his ordeal was completed when he was laid in his tomb just before sunset. Sometimes people were too poor or too urban to have their own flocks. The temple priest provided lambs for this purpose. As a priest would point out an available lamb, he would invariably say, "Hine se, behold the lamb." That's what John's Gospel tells us that the Baptist exclaimed when Jesus passed by. "Hine se, ba Elohim, behold the Lamb of God." Since sacrifices could not be made without the temple after it was destroyed by the Romans, a replacement for the lamb was eventually created called the afikomen. A piece of matzah pierced in stripes and baked until brown spots appeared like bruises became the center of Passover ritual. Removed from a collection of 3 pieces, the middle piece is broken, wrapped in white linen like a shroud, and hidden away, only to return at the end of the ceremony. This afikomen resembles Jesus in his passion, especially in the way both reflect the words of Isaiah 53. It and he was pierced, bruised, striped, chastised, broken, shrouded, and buried.